and I will mute everybody, and then we'll enable um, John to speak. So mute all, and then unmute. John, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, I think I have.
Okay, now we have John here. Can you say a few words about yourself before you do your presentation?
Yes, okay. I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1967 and was posted to Malaysia for a couple of years. And then in 1970, 71, 72, I worked on a recognition of the People's Republic of China, after which I was posted to Hong Kong briefly, and then I was the deputy ambassador in Beijing in 1974 until 1976. So I was there for the last couple of years of the Cultural Revolution. After that, uh, I had three separate stints as the director of the China section of the Department of Foreign Affairs during the course of my 30-year career. I retired in 1996. I didn't have much to do with foreign affairs or China until the new century. But since about 2001, I've been visiting China approximately twice a year. My last visit was before the most recent one in June, July, was to Xinjiang, Ningxia, and Hebei, as well, of course, Beijing. Um, and the visit I've just returned from was I spent 3 weeks in Hainan, which I'll be talking about today. So I think that gives you a bit of a sense of my background. Uh, I spent 3 weeks entirely in Hainan, flew directly to Haikou from Melbourne, and was staying with friends in their holiday place in Hainan. And the first thing to know about Hainan is it's a tropical holiday centre for both international tourists and for um, holiday makers, tourists from within China itself. Whilst I was in Hainan, I visited Boao, where I was based, Qionghai, Fushan, Chiang Mai, Kuantan, Tanmen, Sanya, and a few other places, smaller villages whose names I don't remember. And the first thing I'd like to say about my experience in Hainan is that it reconfirmed my very strong conviction that everything we hear about China in the mainstream media is either a misconception, a distortion, or an outright lie. There is nothing about China in the mainstream media that you can rely on as being plainly truthful. Hainan is an interesting place in that it kind of reflects a microcosm of the whole of China. Because it's a holiday resort place, a bit like Bali, it has extremely high-end, five-star plus holiday hotels on the beaches all around the coast, alongside really underdeveloped and still developing communities where the standard of living is still quite a lot lower than you would find in a tier one city. So almost every city in Hainan is like a combination of a tier 1 city and a tier 4 city, which is quite an interesting mix. So there are still a lot of the very 1980s and 1970s types of housing and shops and markets and so on. And then you sort of go across the road and through guarded gates, and you're in a sort of modern tropical paradise holiday resort. I did a couple of times visited the mineral spa in a couple of those holiday resorts, where they have tiny little fish that nibble your feet to clean your feet, which is rather fun. It's very tickly. It's also remarkable that all of the cities that I visited are connected by high-speed rail. The high-speed train goes from Haikou all around the coast of Hainan and back to Haikou, or sometimes it starts in Sanya and goes all the way around to Haikou, and then from Haikou all the way back to Sanya again. In Chinese terms, it's a slow train. Of course, it only goes 250 kilometers per hour, not the 400 kilometers per hour of some of the high-speed trains on the mainland. But it's still a remarkably impressive journey. It takes you no time at all to get from one place to another, which is why I was able to visit so many. Fushan was quite an interesting town. It's called the coffee culture town. One of the things they're trying to do in Hainan now is encourage the growing and processing and marketing of coffee. And Fushan is the center for that. And they have now an international coffee growers conference center in Fushan. And it's one of the industries which is contributing to the growing prosperity of the population of the island. Getting on to the significance of Hainan itself, if you look at a map, you can see, maybe Albert, you could shift to point out Hainan. Hainan is right down on the southern coastline of mainland China, south of Taiwan, and even south of Hong Kong, projecting into the South China Sea. And it's interesting that the Chinese government sees Hainan as a growing hub for international, domestic and international markets. Hainan enjoys a strategic position at the intersection between China's massive domestic market and the Southeast Asian markets. Its geographical advantage, its industrial base, its cooperation foundation and policy and institutional advantages make it suitable to serve as a vital hub for China, ASEAN regional maritime economic connectivity. There is a Hainan free trade port zero tariff policy for inland sales of processed and value-added goods to encourage ASEAN enterprises to invest in seafood processing facilities. That's on young pool ports special policies. I should mention, of course, that seafood is traditionally the most important industry and means of livelihood for the vast majority of the population of Taiwan, which is a great pity for me because I can't eat seafood. I'm allergic to anything that has shells on the outside. But it's one of the great delicacies. The other significance of Hainan, I should point out, is up near Haikou. very short distance from Haikou on the map there, is a town called Boao. Boao has another tiny island just off its coast, where a bit more than a decade ago, China built the state-of-the-art, luxurious international conference center and hotels and resorts for the Forum for Asia. I think we know it in Australia is referred to as the Asia Forum, which meets every year in that conference center in Boao, and highlights the significance of Hainan as a key center for China's interaction with the whole of the rest of Southeast Asia in particular. Hainan is also very important strategically in a military sense, because as you can see from the map, its position facing into the South China Sea means that it is extremely important for the defense of China's sovereignty over islands and other facilities that are located in the South China Sea. The most important military base on Hainan for that purpose is at Sanya, which is where that red arrow just touched, on the southern tip of Hainan. I wasn't, of course, able to visit the military base. I was only able to drive past it and get an impression of its size, but I do know from reading that it is strategically very important. It's also important, I think, to note that in Boao, pardon me, there is a new, again, state-of-the-art, magnificent piece of architecture called the South China Sea Museum. And that museum contains exhibits of archaeological artifacts that have been retrieved from very deep areas of the South China Sea, from shipwrecks of Chinese vessels dating back to more than 2,000 years ago. One of the most important was, I think, a shipwreck that occurred in about 300 years ago. The exhibits are incredible. There are thousands upon thousands of items that have been dredged out of deep underwater shelves within the South China Sea. Yeah, that's a picture of one of the vessels that was, that's a mock-up, a reconstruction of a Chinese trading vessel of, I think if I'm correct, for some reason I dropped out. That's a picture of the museum. I thought it was an amazing building. But there are some of the artifacts. It provides a pretty much an overwhelming argument for China's claim of sovereignty over the Nansha, the Zhongsha, and the Xisha Islands in the South China Sea. They're referred to in English as the Paracels and the Spratlys. And of course, there are other claims of sovereignty to islands within those groups, notably the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia are the main other claimants. Contrary to the impression we get from the mainstream media, China's relationship with those other claimants and its dealings with them over their competing claims have been largely diplomatic and non-aggressive and very much a process of negotiating mutually beneficial.
To walk to the toilet, I don't think you need to bring a nurse with you anymore. I think you can.
What's that?
Oh, somebody I mute.
Oh,
so please continue.
Yeah. So the way in which China has been handling the competing claims for sovereignty over different islands within those various archipelagos has been very much on the basis of mutually beneficial exploitation of the resources of the area. In those archipelagos, in response to the American so-called pivot to Asia in 2011, where the United States put its Sixth Fleet on China's doorstep. And so China has, quite understandably, in my view, reacted by building some offshore military bases within its exclusive economic zone, the 200-mile economic zone. So I think I should make the point now that even though we have, I think, been seeing various conciliatory statements by President Trump about how he gets on very well with President Xi Jinping and how he hopes to have a good working relationship with China. The deep state, as it's called, the Washington warmongers, as I call them, the neocons who have been in power within the bureaucracy in Washington since at least the Clinton administration, are still determined to try to provoke China into a war as a means of slowing down and derailing China's development and its economic cooperation development with other countries. And to that end, of course, we have seen the United States heavily militarizing Australia and has strongly pushed Australia into military cooperation, particularly with Japan and the Philippines. And towards the end of last year, there was a major exercise with about 10,000 Australian ADF personnel with the Philippines in an exercise, an aerial and maritime exercise, which was clearly designed to practice a potential land invasion, to forestall a mutated Chinese attack on its own province of Taiwan. We keep hearing about how China has gotten very aggressive policy towards Taiwan. China's policy statements about Taiwan, of course, have always been the same ever since 1972, when we recognized China, which is that Taiwan is and has always been a province of China, and even the government of the Republic of China, which is which withdrew to Taiwan, took exactly the same view that Taiwan is a province of China. And all recent policy statements have been that the Chinese people on either side of the Taiwan Strait are members of the same family, and the aspiration is for the eventual full reintegration of the members of the family on both sides, with a peaceful reintegration. The New Year's statement or address by Xi Jinping this year, in fact, didn't even mention that China reserves the right to use force to prevent Taiwan from seceding from China's sovereignty. It talked only of the friendly development of familial relations between the peoples on both sides of the strait. That's taken me a little bit away from Hainan, but I felt it necessary to mention that because despite what President Trump might be trying to lead us to believe, the neocons in Washington are still pushing for Australia to be engaged in a war with China over Taiwan, or I think more probably these days in a war with China over its competition with the Philippines. I would not be at all surprised if a so-called false flag operation took place sometime in the near future between the Philippines and China, to create a pretext for going to war. This has happened many times before. Of course, way back at the time of the Vietnam War, the excuse that was used for the increased United States military involvement in Vietnam was in fact also a false flag operation. So, and the most important point I want to make is that given the continuing pressure for Australia to join in a conflict against China, that and given the bipartisan approach that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party in Australia have adopted towards China at the behest of the United States, the policy is still one of adhering to what the United States demands of us, mainly under the ANZUS and now the AUKUS agreements. Back in 1971, when we were working on recognizing the People's Republic of China, of course, we did produce in Foreign Affairs a policy planning paper which made it clear that Australia ought to regard the ANZUS alliance as less important in the future than it has been in the past, and should concentrate on the development of independent policies based on Australia's own national interest and on the interests of our near neighbours. That obviously was not adopted as policy, but it's more true today than it ever was. So with the elections coming up in Australia, I think it is vitally important that everybody should vote for a third party. I don't care which third party you prefer, but the idea is that to not vote for either the Labor or the Liberal parties in order to get the message across that that we do not wish to go to war against China on any pretext, because our relationship with China, and especially our trade with China, is far too important to simply demolish by going to war. So they're the main thoughts that sort of arose from my 3 weeks in Hainan. There were a number of other interesting places I visited. The port of Tanmen, which is quite near Bo'ao, is 1,000 years old. It's a fishing port, and most of the fishing that was done out of Tanmen was in fact into the South China Sea. And of course, the museum shows a lot of the relics of the fishing activities of previous centuries all throughout the South China Seas. Another very interesting visit I did was to a place called the Tsai Family Mansion, which is also not far from Bo'ao. Mr. Tsai was in fact a Chinese trader who in the 19th century ventured forth into Southeast Asia and set up business in Indonesia, and was in fact very successful and built up a very great fortune. And he later returned to Hainan and built what is called the family mansion, which is like a kind of fortress village almost of numerous extremely strong and well-built buildings, which has served as a refuge for people who escaping from the typhoon that hit Hainan last year, amongst other things. I met the lady who is currently the owner of the Tsai family mansion. She is the daughter-in-law of the son of the original Mr. Tsai, and very graciously welcomed me into the village and gave me a personal tour of the whole place, and an account of her family history and of how she was able to regain the title over the property for the family in perpetuity, which of course gives the lie to another piece of propaganda which we see from time to time from the mainstream media, that private property is curtailed by the People's Republic of China government, by the Communist Party of China, and that people have great difficulty in regards to private ownership. And of course, she is living proof that that is not the case. And of course, the friends with whom I stayed are also living proof that it is not the case, because they loaned me a very comfortable apartment, holiday apartment, within one of the upmarket holiday communities in Bo'ao. They themselves were on holiday there in another townhouse unit that they also own. So private property ownership is very widespread. Another interesting thing about Hainan, which I think reflects its status as a kind of microcosm of China as a whole, is that it has people who come from all parts of China to holiday, to have a tropical South Sea holiday in Hainan. I came across people from as far away as Xinjiang. And in fact, some of the friends that I had met in Xinjiang back in June, July, were on holiday in at the town of Chiang Mai, which was near Fushan, and I went and visited them there and spent a day in their holiday home in Chiang Mai. And of course, lots and lots of people coming from Beijing and even further north, even Heilongjiang, which is right up north. They put their cars on the high-speed train, which zips them down to Haikou in no time at all. And then they take their cars off the train and use them to drive around on the island. And so I saw registration plates from Beijing and Heilongjiang and I think Jiangsu, Xinjiang, Yunnan, all over the place. So some of these people who have ventured to Hainan have in fact settled there and started businesses there, in particular restaurants. So people from Xinjiang, for instance, who would traditional Uyghur food, are able to go to Uyghur restaurants that are on Hainan. So, and one of the restaurants that my friend and I went to on a number of occasions was a Dongbei restaurant, which of course means northeast style food, similar to the food that you might get from the average restaurant in Beijing. My friend is Beijing born, so he tended to prefer Dongbei food, but you could get almost any particular style of cuisine that you might hanker for in Boao itself, or any of these other towns. So that's about the main sketch that I could give you about Hainan today, and the main points that I wanted to emphasize.
Yes, John.
I don't know. Does anybody have any question?
Yes, there's one question posted on our chat. Can you discuss the recent boycotts from China around wine, grains,
I can't hear you.
slaughters? Why did it happen, and was it reasonable?
Keeps dropping out.
I'm dropping out. Oh, John is dropping out. Anyway, John, come back. Okay, unfortunately, I have to wait for him to get connected again. But anyway, from my reading, I think some of these restrictions or boycotts have been lifted since the Labour government came into power. But
trade restrictions with Australia, yes. The last of them was the lobster trade. Australian lobster is now being imported by China here, in fact. So there was quite a lot of Australian lobster on the market.
Sorry, John, you are dropping out.
Yeah, so are you.
Okay, you are back. Okay, can you repeat again? Can you discuss the recent boycotts from China about the Australian produce? I learned that they have been lifted. Is that right?
Yes, the last of them was the lobster. and China's resumed importing Australian lobster, as I said, just in time for the Chinese New Year celebration. So there was a lot of Australian lobster on the market. But I was served Australian wine at various dinners that I attended. Australian wine is back on the market in China in a fairly significant way. So the restrictions, I wouldn't call them boycotts, but the restrictions that China imposed during the the Morrison government period were in response to not so much the political remarks that Morrison had made against China, but more a reaction under the rules of the WTO. China had been bringing many cases against Australia at the WTO for Australia's restrictions on Chinese imports into Australia and on Chinese investment into Australia. And although the WTO had ruled in most of those cases in China's favour, Australia had continued with its various so-called anti-dumping measures against China. And so China introduced anti-dumping measures against Australia. It was important, I think, to realise that the items of trade that China chose to restrict were not significant in terms of their importance to Australia's trade balance as a whole. China continued to import Australian coal and Australian iron ore right through that period. And in fact, during the period of the so-called boycotts, China's imports from Australia increased. Australia's trade surplus, its trade income from sales to China increased throughout the period that China was so-called boycotting Australian trade. So although it had a serious impact on those sectors of the Australian economy that were affected, they weren't significant in overall terms in terms of Australia's balance of trade with China. So at a national level, Australia really didn't suffer. The poor unfortunate Australians who were farmers or fishermen who were and wine growers who were impacted, of course, were quite severely impacted, but it was mischaracterized, I think, and quite falsely represented in the press as a Chinese sort of punishment of Australia's daring to stand up to China, as Morrison put it. It was more a part of an ongoing trade dispute between China and Australia, which had been carried out in the framework of the World Trade Organization for nearly a decade. But that's behind us now anyway, because there are no longer any restrictions on any of the Australian exports to China.
But there are still restrictions for the 5G equipment from China into Australia.
Yes, it didn't make any change to Australia's policy towards China, even though China has changed its policy towards Australia. We still take the attitude that China is a security threat because of its possible takeover of Australia, which of course is ludicrous. The level of Chinese investment into Australia, including from Hong Kong, is 2.5% of total foreign investment, whereas the UK and the United States account for more than 25% of foreign investment into Australia. And the United States investment in Australia has enabled it to capture majority control of all the major companies in all the major sectors of the Australian economy. So American majority shareholding control all of our banks, for instance. It controls our major mining companies, BHP, Fortescue Metals, and Rio Tinto, and so on. It controls vast areas of our food production and also our food processing and food retailing industries as well. And of course, it has complete control over our IT. No business can do any business these days in Australia without access to the internet. And the means of access to the internet and the internet itself in Australia is controlled by the United States. So the much greater risk to Australia's security, in fact, comes from the United States' ability to virtually shut down Australia at a moment's notice. I surmise, I'm only guessing, that the government, whichever government is in power, Liberal or Labor, is aware of the extent of the United States' stranglehold over the Australian economy, and that is the reason why both sides of politics adhere so closely to the concept of the ANZUS Treaty as being the instrument which guarantees the United States will protect Australia. Of course, the ANZUS Treaty does no such thing. There is nothing in the ANZUS Treaty which guarantees that the United States would, in fact, actively, militarily engage in the protection of Australia if Australia were to come under attack. And I believe personally that we have very foolishly alienated ourselves from our neighbours. Indonesia is an extremely large country in terms of its population. It is the largest Muslim country outside of the Middle East. Enormous resources, and has made it very, very clear that it completely disagrees with Australia's attitude towards China. So Indonesia has entered into a comprehensive economic and strategic partnership with China. Indonesia participates in China's international Belt and Road Initiative. China has just completed the high-speed rail project from Jakarta to Bandung, and I believe is going to continue that project further into the rest of Indonesia. And Indonesia, of course, has recently banned the export of raw ore, nickel ore, from Indonesia in favour of smelting it in country and exporting the value-added material. And the country that has entered into an agreement and has begun, in fact, constructing the nickel ore processing facility within Indonesia is in fact a Chinese company. So it's under the agreement between the Chinese government and the Indonesian government. So we cannot take for granted or take with any degree of assurance whatsoever the Labour foreign minister's assurances that in a conflict with China we could look to our partners in ASEAN to support us, because it's quite evident they would not. ASEAN as an organisation, the 10 countries of the Southeast Asian organisation, as an organisation has a comprehensive strategic partnership with China, as well as the individual countries within ASEAN having their own separate strategic economic partnership agreements, and all of them are participating in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Hanoi's metro system, for instance, has just been completed in, I think, last year by China. The high-speed rail from Yunnan to Vientiane in Laos has been opened and has already made a significant difference to Laos's trade balance. And that high-speed rail is planned to extend from Vientiane all the way through to Bangkok in Thailand. And work on that is continuing. I don't know how far it has got yet, but it is definitely underway. They're working at both ends, as the Chinese engineers are working in Laos towards Thailand, and there are Chinese engineers in Thailand working towards Laos. So that will make a huge difference, particularly to Laos, which is a landlocked country, to its ability to trade both within the Southeast Asian region and beyond, which should greatly increase the prosperity of an otherwise relatively underdeveloped and rather impoverished country. China has also got development cooperation projects with Cambodia, which is another country which suffered great devastation as a result of the United States interventions in Indochina during the period of the Vietnam War. That's got us a long way away from Hainan.
With your experience in diplomats. Okay, there's another question here. Why do the Australian media misreports the truth?
Well, Australian media is completely captured by the United States. In Australia, the Murdoch organisation controls something of the order of 80% of mainstream media in Australia, and it is very much locked into the United States propaganda machine. So what we get from mainstream media in Australia is always designed to serve United States foreign and defence policy interests in the region. And the United States has continued to insist that its policy for the Asia Pacific is that it should maintain United States dominance of the Indo-Pacific region. And so China is always presented in the mainstream media as a potential threat to Australia, designed to do what is frequently called to manufacture public consent to going to war with China if and when the United States decides that that is the necessary course. Australia, I think, from a foreign and defence policy point of view, is caught between a rock and a hard place. I think we know from past experience and from looking at the experience of many other countries that the United States will dispense with any ally if it sees that it's in its interest to do so. So were Australia to stand up and say to the United States, under no circumstances will Australia go to war in support of the United States in the South China Sea, then we would inevitably suffer a variety of punishments from the United States. We can see that with Donald Trump at the moment, punishing Mexico and punishing Canada, the two closest and most important allies of the United States, with tariff barriers, which he imagines will force Canada and the United States to change some of their trade policies towards the United States. He's also said, I think in an interview yesterday, that he will be imposing punishing tariffs on Europe because he considers that the trade imbalance between the United States and Europe is unfair, and that imposing tariffs is the best way to rectify that. I personally believe that given the complexity of international trade and supply chains and so on, that Trump's tariff barriers will only succeed in further damaging the United States economy, which is heavily dependent on imports in particular from China for inputs into the American industrial base, particularly the high-tech area. China was dependent upon imports from the United States of very high-end microchips, but with the United States moves under Trump and then under Biden to block the export of high-end microchips from the United States, all that has happened is that China has moved very, very rapidly to advance its ability to produce its own high-end microchips. They're down to a 7-nanometer microchip already. So instead of importing microchips from Intel, for instance, and NVIDIA, the two major exporters to China, those have been virtually cut off. And so China is now manufacturing its own. It was prevented from continuing to import chip etching machinery from the most important company in the world for such machinery based in the Netherlands. So it has now built its own based on what it had previously already imported. So China has strengthened its domestic supply chain for its industries, even its very high-tech industries, rather than having been weakened.
Okay, John, there's two questions here. The first one, how come the democratic laws and forces of Australia and US can't stand to the pressures of the neocons?
Well, the neocons control, I think Jeffrey Sachs or one of the other international commentators on the United States and United States policy made the point that the bureaucracy in Washington is multi-layered, and about 80% or more of American foreign policy is in fact not determined by the president, it's not even determined by the Congress, it's determined by the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy is dominated by neocons who came into the bureaucracy at the period of Ronald Reagan. And they are all advocates of international globalization and privatization, and very strong advocates of the use of America's military power to reinforce its dominance politically and economically in the world. And that is why, of course, they see China as their number one threat, as they call it. The greatest challenge to United States hegemony across the globe is in fact China, because it has, by its phenomenal economic rise over the last nearly 100 years now, has created an alternative for countries of the global south, which after all represent the majority of the world population, to obtain finance and technology and development assistance and so on from where they used to have to go to the World Bank and the IMF, which then got them stuck with loans that they simply could not repay. They have now an alternative to turn to away from the United States. And many of the countries that are trading with China now are moving to trade in local currencies and to not use the American dollar as the principal instrument of exchange, which of course threatens the position of the United States dollar as the principal currency of exchange around the world. It used to be up in the 90% of world trade was conducted in US dollars. I saw a figure only this weekend that world trade now conducted in US dollars is down to 45%. So the dollar dominance in international trade and finance has already dwindled, and many countries, particularly those that have joined the BRICS either as full partners or as cooperating members, or should say full members or cooperating partners, are divesting themselves of their holdings of United States dollars. So they're reducing their reserves of US dollars. Japan, in particular, used to be the number one, in fact, a holder of US debt. That is, they bought more United States Treasury bonds than any other country in the world. And China was next. So China and Japan between them held more United States debt than they loaned more money to the United States than any other country in the world, which is how the United States has been funding its $35 trillion deficit. The debt the US owes now to the rest of the world exceeds its gross national product by 125%. So the United States is not in a position to repay its debts. And China and Japan have been selling their treasury bonds or divesting themselves of United States treasury bonds, and they're holding gradually less and less of the United States debt. I think probably because in the long term they see it as a possibility that the United States may end up simply defaulting on its debt because it has no capacity to repay. So as the BRICS, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa organization, which has now increased to 10 full members. Indonesia recently was accepted as a full member of the BRICS Plus organization, and Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam are also incorporating partnership with the BRICS, and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, of course, is a very, very important partner in the BRICS now. As all these countries trade more and more with each other outside of the US dollar, that weakens the United States' ability to continue to borrow to fund its budget. And eventually it will find itself unable to continue to fund its huge budgetary deficit. And that is another reason why the United States, neocons in particular, see it as necessary for the United States to leverage its remaining military dominance to try to force other countries into sticking with the United States dollar. And of course, Donald Trump has said, rather unwisely in my view, that any country that ceases to use the United States dollar for international trade would be punished by the United States with 100% tariff on any of their goods that they want to export into the United States. That's only would only further isolate the United States. As we've seen with Russia, all of the sanctions, and Russia is the most heavily sanctioned country, sanctioned by the United States. I think 128 different sanctions have been imposed since 2014, and certainly an awful lot of them since the onset of the Ukraine war in 2022. The only thing that has happened there is that instead of weakening Russia, it's meant that Russia has virtually ceased any major trading with the West and is trading with the global South. India buys a vast amount of Russian oil, for instance. Australia says that, of course, because of the war in Ukraine, Australia will not import Russian oil. So what happens? Russia sells its oil to India, which passes it on to Singapore, and we buy our oil from Singapore, but we're buying it from Russia. So we are not having any impact in our sanctions on Russia either. Russia's economic partnership with China has enormously intensified. They're building new gas pipelines from Russia into China. There is, of course, existing gas pipelines from Russia into China. but there are new ones through Siberia being built, which will significantly increase China's consumption of Russia's gas. And the level of Russian sales of its next most important commodity of oil have not significantly suffered. They dropped quite dramatically in the early days of the sanctions, but once India in particular entered into an agreement with Russia to buy Russian oil using rubles, not the dollar, for payment, Russian sales to India increased exponentially, and the Russian oil industry and oil income is doing quite well. America's economic growth is predicted by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to increase by 2.5% across the 24-25 period. Russia's is predicted to increase by 4.8%. China's is predicted to increase by 7.2%, and 5.2%, and India's GDP growth is going to increase by a remarkable 7.8%. So the United States is well behind the economic growth rate of most of its competitors, and the G7, the group of Western countries, which, by the way, I call the genocidal seven because they all are complicit in the slaughter of the Palestinian people in Gaza. But the G7 as a whole, their contribution to world GDP is now less than the contribution of the BRICS plus countries.
Okay, now this Neil, can you unmute yourself and ask your questions about Uyghurs? Laurel, can you please unmute yourself? Okay, while we are waiting, there's another question. Is China suffering from an economic downturn, or it is misrepresented in the media?
Well, the short answer is yes, it is misrepresented in the media. China is going through a period of economic slowdown. There's no doubt about that. Many of my friends in China, of course, are engaged in business, and they complain about the sluggishness of business in China at the moment. But an economic downturn which results in an annual growth rate of 5.2% doesn't represent, in my mind, a significant economic disaster by any means. China's still one of the three most significant economic powerhouses in the world. So, and it shows no sign really of a deteriorating economy. The opposite is true. The slowdown has happened. A lot of it was largely due to the housing bubble, which to a very large extent the Chinese government has succeeded in successfully deflating without impacting the whole of the economy across the board. They did it, interestingly, I think, by the central government providing funding to provincial governments to buy the properties of the private property development companies who were in liquidation, specifically to enable the provincial governments to provide low-cost housing for the people. So, as Xi Jinping said, housing is for people to live in, not for people to invest in. And so that policy has been implemented by buying up the companies in liquidation, buying up their properties and making them available for purchase at affordable prices to people who were looking for modern housing. Another point I would make is that frequently we read about China's impending economic disaster because of an aging population and a diminishing demographic increase in terms of new births and younger people. And again, it is true that people of marriageable age are marrying later and having fewer children. They are being encouraged now, instead of the one China policy, they're being encouraged to have more than one child. But the so-called demographic time bomb, I think, is vastly exaggerated in the Western media. My own personal impression, as from traveling all the way from Xinjiang across the entire country and now down into Hainan, so I've been to most of the major cities in China and most of the regional areas in China. And I am always overwhelmed and really delighted at the number of young parents with small babies and toddlers that I see everywhere all over the country. It is remarkable how a crowd in a shopping mall would seem to consist almost entirely of people in their mid-20s to mid-30s with young children. So I think that this crisis of having to look after an aging population is well into the future, if it ever happens.
Okay.
Get me, Alfred. I'm
Yes.
ready.
Yeah, please ask your question.
John, in regard to the Uyghur situation in China, is it true, from your experience, that they're interned in what has been referred to as re-education camps, subject to human violations, forced labour, and issues like that?
That's been thoroughly debunked, not just by myself, but by an academic called Jack James, a young lady who is a doctorate of law. She did a legal forensic analysis of the ASPI reports of so-called forced labor of Uyghurs, and also of the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reports. And in every single case, in academic documents ranging over more
Oh my God.
I haven't seen specifically with the aim of satisfying myself on the ground that these reports were untrue. And I was more than satisfied that they were indeed untrue, because in Xinjiang I visited Urumqi, Turpan, and Kashgar. Kashgar is the kind of the epicenter of Uyghur culture in Xinjiang. I think it is important to always remember that Xinjiang is officially the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So the provincial government of Xinjiang is in fact a largely Uyghur government. And I saw personally no sign of any form of oppression of Uyghur people, even in Kashgar, which was one of the places that was affected by Islamic terrorist operations in the late 90s and early 21st century. You know, I think the 1996 till about 2010 or thereabouts, where there's a whole series of terrorist attacks by representatives of the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement. So while I was in Kashgar, for instance, there was a noticeable police presence. They were police and like we have here in Melbourne, the what they call them, emergency response units. I saw one emergency response unit parked at the side of the main square in Urumqi during one evening when I was dancing on the square with my Uyghur lady host, who had taken me to dinner that evening, and there we went to the main square and joined in the popular pastime of dancing the local folk dances. But people seemed to be very, very comfortable and quite pleased, in fact, that there was a security presence, because the people who were most significantly impacted by the ETIM terrorist attacks were, in fact, Uyghur people who were being attacked for not adhering to the East Turkestan independence movement. I was asked by a friend here in Australia, how did I know that the Uyghur people were not being oppressed, because I couldn't speak Uyghur. And I said, I don't think it is really necessary to be able to speak the language to be able to tell whether people are being oppressed or not. You can tell by their demeanor, by the way they interact with you. When you buy something from them, or you go to a Uyghur restaurant to have dinner, or you visit a Uyghur shop, which is there was one very interesting shop in Kashgar, which is a mini museum promoting the sale of traditional costume, which was quite fascinating. And none of this represented to me any sign of oppression. I saw particularly young people interacting with and joking and laughing with the police in Kashgar, the police patrolling around the streets. Very few of them, but there was a kind of a two-man patrol which would sort of walk up and down the streets of the historic centre, and everybody got on with them very well. The police in China are remarkably friendly and helpful. By the way, I have had wonderful experiences with Chinese police. In fact, a little anecdote. Many years ago now, would have been in about 2015, I think, I was walking across Tiananmen Square to go to a concert at the Arts Centre on the far side of the square. And that square is about 1 kilometre wide, and of course is always full of people. And I tripped over a concrete bollard and fell flat on my face, and grazed my knees and my nose, and was a bit momentarily dazed. And within seconds, a crowd had formed around me to see if I was okay. My Chinese friend accompanying me was very upset. A policeman arrived on a little motor electric scooter to see what was going on. my friend berated him roundly for the authorities having left this ridiculous bollard sitting in the middle of the pathway for me to trip over. The policeman then immediately called a paramedic who came up in his little electric sort of ambulance, sat me down on a stool and patched up my knees and put a sticking plaster on my nose. And one little girl standing next to her mother, observing all this, looked up at her mother and said, "Mummy, he has a big nose." And then the paramedic said, "Well, now I'm going to put you in my little van and take you to hospital." And I said, "No, you're not." And he said, "Well, we have to check if you've got concussion." And I said, "I can assure you I do not have concussion, and I have to get to the concert on time." And he said, "In that case, I'll drive you there." And so he drove me to the concert in his little van with his red and blue light flashing. And that was how I got to the concert on time. So that's a very long and involved answer to your question, Noel, but really I find the propaganda regarding the Uyghurs and especially the so-called forced labour is really laughable.
Yes. We will explore the questions with Jerry Gray 1 week after today in our third session. And next week, we will have Robbie Warwick, the research director of the Australian Citizen Party, with us. And we will discuss about our politics. Thank you so much, John. Noel, you have follow-up question?
Yeah, Alfred, does John have a...
Sorry, I got cut off.
Alfred?
Sorry, Noel, the only other thing I would say is that another friend, Jerry Gray, who lives in Zhongshan in China, is a very... he posts a thing he calls Jerry's Take on China almost every day. He did 2 bicycle trips the length of Xinjiang over the past several years. Specifically, he went to the geographical coordinates that ASPI had claimed were locations of labour camps and concentration camps, they called them, and couldn't find them. He said it was just barren landscape and nothing there. That is not to say that China has not engaged in re-education of known terrorists. Those who were arrested as a result of terrorist operations or terrorist actions have in fact been re-educated. Australia has the same policy, by the way.
I know.
We also have a policy of re-educating people who are arrested for potential terrorism. So it's not exclusive to China, but it is not something that is imposed on the entire Uyghur population as a whole. The Uyghur population, by the way, has never been subjected to the one-child policy. So it's the population of the Uyghur population of Xinjiang increased by 20% in a decade, whereas the Han Chinese population, I think, grew in Xinjiang by about 5%. And the town of Turpan, which is very famous for grape growing, is a majority Uyghur population and quite a prosperous, relatively smaller town in the grape growing industry.
John, while you're there, I found your presentation fascinating, I must admit, really good. Do you have a website? This is my next question, actually. Do you have a website where we can follow you?
No, unfortunately, I do not.
Well, that's a shame.
I do occasionally appear on YouTube when I do interviews with the Citizens Party. The Citizens Party is the only party in Australia which has consistently for the last 30 years advocated for an independent foreign policy, and in particular has always worked very hard for a mutually beneficial and cooperative relationship with China, which is why I occasionally do interviews with them which go up on YouTube.
Right.
I'm also in correspondence with Jerry Gray, who is an Australian, but he lives in Zhongshan, and he is very, very well worth following. He has amazing insights into everyday China, which I think everybody should be aware of.
Does he have a website?
He has a website.
You go on YouTube and search for Jerry's Take on China. You will find him.
Yeah, that's right. On YouTube, you just put in Jerry's Take on China, and up he pops. If you put Citizens Insight into your search words, you'll get my interviews with the Citizens Party. And I should say that I believe very strongly that in the next election here in Australia, everybody should vote for a Citizens Party candidate if you have one in your electorate. They will be fielding a lot of candidates, and we need desperately an alternative force and an alternative voice in the federal parliament. So that's my political plug for the day.
Thank you, John. Loved your presentation.
Okay. We really appreciate John's presentation today. And next week, as I said, we will have the research director from the Australian Citizen Party. And then the week following it, we'll have Jerry Gray. So we look forward to 2 exciting presentations in the coming 2 weeks. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, and especially thank you, John.
Well,
thank you,
Thank you, Albert. I just said that.
Sorry? Okay, in that case, we'll...
That's interesting. Both, as you would know, both Jerry Gray and Robert Barwick, the research director at the Citizens Party, are, of course, well known to me. And I'm sure they will say things very much in agreement with what I've said.
If you have time, you can join us as well next week and the week after using the same link I sent you.
Okay, thank you. I'll save it.
Okay. Thank you so much, John, and thank you, everybody. We'll see each other in the same time next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was very good.
Thank you, Alfred.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.